Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I am doing a spooky Halloween painting for you. I originally had a different picture lined up for today's video, but I just had some Halloween excitement in me and I needed to get it out. So I chose to do a jack-o'-lantern, and I've done a lot of pumpkins this season with watercolors and pastels for different classes I've been teaching, but none of them have been trimmed into jack-o'-lanterns where I am playing with the lighting that comes from them. Because usually you light your jack-o'-lanterns at night, so you have the dark background and you have the glowing lights from inside the pumpkin, and it creates this like soft glow and highlights and shadows that are really interesting, and so that is why I chose to do this piece. I am working on UArt sanded paper, and I am currently doing an underpainting using Dr. Ph Martins Bombay India inks. And the reason why I chose to do this for the underpainting is, one, I wanted an underpainting with really strong colors. With the scene being set kind of in the dark or at night and having high contrast, I really wanted to make sure I had the base colors that would support it, because I didn't want to spend hours blending my pastels to cover the white of the paper. I also knew there's going to be a lot of color saturation, and the easiest way to get a lot of color saturation and be able to get really dark darks and not have to worry about it kind of flaking off or having to do tons of blending is by using inks. I've done underpaintings using watercolor or blending out pastels using watercolor or water or alcohol, but I found when I want really strong colors to be the base painting or the underpainting, the Bombay inks are the way to go. And it's just UArt sanded paper, and the image was transferred using carbon transfer paper. So I drew the picture on my iPad, printed it out, and then just transferred it using carbon paper. The reason why I like using the transfer paper is because it leaves kind of like a waxy texture on it, and it works really good for pastels because it doesn't smudge or get picked back up. If I sketched this out using graphite on the sanded paper, it would smudge and smear everywhere, and it would tinge everything kind of a gray tone. The alcohol inks are really nice because they dry quickly, so I'm just blocking in the highlights and the shadows. If I could go back and do this again, I would have made the background even darker to start with. I was a little concerned about making it too dark, but that's something I had to keep going back and darkening more and more and more as I went. And so if I could go back, I would have really mixed that purple with some black ink to just really darken up those values. The ink dries quickly, so there's not tons of blending that you're doing. You can blend it out with some plain alcohol to really soften it or to lighten it, but that's not my goal. I'm just blocking in shadows and highlights and getting those base colors down. And once it was dry and I had all those colors blocked in, then I came in with my pan pastels. Pan pastels are a really, really finely milled form of pastel that's really, really soft. So you can't hold it in a traditional pastel stick or even like a pastel pencil. It has to be almost like in a makeup compact, and you apply it using sponges to your paper. And there's tools that they sell that go with them called soft tools with an extra F, and you dip them into these pans of pigment and then apply them to your paper. And I really like these, especially for the early layers, because one, you can get a really painterly effect with how the colors lay down and how you apply them, but they're also so finely milled that they really sink into the paper crevices or the tooth of the paper and allow you to do a lot of layers over the top, because it doesn't do big thick layers of pastels. I'm not being too particular about which brand of pastel pencils I'm using for this video. I'm just picking the colors I want. So sometimes I'll pick a specific brand to use in a video because I'm reviewing it or I'm simplifying the supply list. But for this, I just went through my collection and picked the colors I wanted. I wanted a lot of oranges and reds and yellows, some rusty reddish brown colors, magentas, dark purples, blacks, dark browns, some of those colors that can really be used to pull in the shadows along with the highlights. So I have Derwent pencils, I have Caran d'Ache pencils, Stabilo Carbothello ones, and Faber-Castell pencils. I think those were the 4 brands that I used for this. And again, I talked about it in my pastel pencil deep dive. Pastel pencils are pretty universal amongst themselves. You can mix and match and get the colors you want, and it doesn't really matter which brand. They should all work together pretty nicely. So at this stage of the painting, I am not really focused on detail or refining lines or anything like that. I am just blocking in color, and I'm trying to get those colors to be the correct value. So I'm trying to make sure those dark areas are dark, the bright highlights are absolutely the brightest point on the picture, and then getting the variations in mid-tone correct, so that this pumpkin 1 has dimension and doesn't read as flat. That means the only white that I'm using in this picture is going to be coming from those eyes, and then everything else needs to be darker than that. I also need to have high contrast because this picture is set in kind of a more moodier lighting. It's not like full daylight, so there's going to be some really dark darks. In fact, if I could go back and do this picture again, I would have had the ink value in that background be darker. I think I mentioned that earlier. And I would have started using darker pastels to begin with as well in those shadowed areas. Sometimes it can be intimidating to make things that dark to start with, but all it meant is that I had to go back and do more layers as I went along. But some of those things seem dark at first, and then you put the other colors around it and you realize it needs to go darker. A nice thing about being in these early stages of pastel artwork is that you don't have to have a super sharp line to get soft blends. With colored pencils, you're usually working in like circles, and you're having to be really careful with how you layer so you get soft, smooth transitions and blends. But being able to like manually blend your pastels using like different kind of blending tools, you don't have to be as precise. So you don't have to have your pencil at quite as sharp of a point unless you're trying to get really, really fine details, which wasn't my goal with this picture at all. Like I mentioned earlier, I just wanted to play with lighting and color and just do something fun for Halloween. I did this picture last minute. It was October 29th, and I was just feeling kind of in a funk because I had been prepping so much for classes, and I realized I wanted to just be creative and do something for the fun of creating. So I decided to do a jack-o'-lantern picture. So you can see I had candles originally in this picture, and I drew them and I liked them on my sketch that I did on my iPad. But then as I was working on the picture, I felt like it was distracting and pulling away from the main focus, which was the jack-o'-lantern. So I decided to cover them up and keep working. And that's one of the things I love about pastels, is you can course correct and cover up what you were doing before pretty easily. Whereas watercolor, it's a little trickier. I just started blocking that in. You can see there's a little bit of a white halo there, but it eventually goes away. But just blocking in the colors, you can see those lines are starting to get a little bit more refined. Started blocking in the shapes of the little pumpkins and gourds that are around the main one, and getting their colors correct in their values. And again, that smallest pumpkin that's kind of on the far left, that's kind of behind the other ones, is going to start being a lot darker than the rest. And that's going to help it recede visually and not compete with the one that's in front of it. So I think the only blending tools I used for this piece were rubber-based tools. So I had the little clay shapers, which are like almost in a pencil form, and they have a rubber tip on the end in different shapes. And I used those for this finer details. And then the big gray wedge shape that I used, that's called a catalyst. I think I bought it at Hobby Lobby like 5 years ago, and it's gradually getting smaller and smaller as the edges get worn down on the sanded paper, but I really like it because it doesn't overblend or pick up too much pigment. It just kind of helps like soften the edges just a bit. And then when I was going to be working and resting my hand on my paper, I just have a sheet of glassine paper. Tracing paper works as well, just to keep the pigments from smudging on my hand or messing up the work I've done, because I don't want to mess up all the hard work I've been doing, and I don't want to get my hands super filthy or transfer oil from my hand onto the picture, because that will affect how the colors look and how archival the picture would end up being. At this point in the painting, I was getting pretty excited with how it was coming along, because it was so different than my normal, and it was really fun pushing myself in new ways. And when you start seeing it come together, that is a really exciting moment as an artist, and it's something I've never gotten over. I always get excited when I see a piece start to come together. And the last couple weeks have been kind of hard around here. My kids were really sick with COVID, and then stomach flu, and just kind of a cascade of illness. And then we got over that, and then we've had fall break and parent-teacher conferences and end of term and home learning days. And so they haven't had a full week at school for the entire month of October. There's always been a reason why they've had short days or days off, which makes it kind of hard when you run a business from home and you're trying to function. And it was right during that time my teaching at the local university started, and it's just been really chaotic and busy. And I really enjoyed the chance to just sit down and paint and have some fun. They got into a creative frenzy while I was working on this, making houses for their stuffed animal dogs using paper. They decorated them all and had a lot of fun. And I think we got a lot of creative antsiness out of ourselves and are feeling less grumpy because of it. I'm sorry if some of my sentences are a little mumbled or they don't quite make sense. It's because I'm doing the voiceover at 1:30 in the morning. With my kids being home today, and they're going to be home tomorrow, and being on a tight deadline, I couldn't start doing the voiceover until the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, or else you'd be hearing screaming and feet and the sound of my dog running around, and that gets a little distracting in the voiceovers. So something I use a lot in my pastel work, I mentioned it in like my 5 favorite pastel tools video, but I use something called workable fixative. It's not always shown in the videos because you need to have good ventilation to use it, and I also don't want to risk it splattering on my camera lens. But what that does is, one, it seals the pastel layers that you've already done. It can add a little bit more texture so you can draw over the top of it. It's not a finishing layer. So if you have done too many layers of pastel and you can tell that your paper's not going to accept very many more layers, a layer of workable fixative can help with that. But honestly, I use it a lot to darken things. So I might have a whole area that's a little bit too light. Instead of redrawing it all, I might do a spray or two of the workable fixative, let it dry, and then I can come back over and refine details. One thing to keep in mind though is workable fixative can add a little bit of a sheen to your image or your painting if you do too thick of a layer. But it's a great way to kind of darken things up, and then you can build some darker layers over the top without worrying about it mixing with the colors that you'd already laid down, or having to cover the whole thing with an opaque layer of pastel. And at this stage of the painting, I thought I was pretty well done. You'll see that I leave my signature in a second because I liked the way it looked in the studio lighting. But then later on, when I moved it to different locations to take photos and look at it from different areas of the house, I realized it needed just a little bit more tweaking. And this is why I always say, take a break, come look at it with fresh eyes a day or two later, because things that weren't standing out drastically to you before that needs to be adjusted suddenly become very obvious. It's kind of like taking a break from a paper you're writing in school. If you've been writing it for hours on end, your brain kind of fills in your mistakes and you don't see any errors. But if you take a break from it and you come back at it with fresh eyes, you see all the grammar and spelling mistakes you made. So just take a break, come at it with fresh eyes. But what I realized when I had started taking pictures of it in different locations and looking at it in different lighting was that background needed to be darkened up quite a bit. It looked fine, flat on my table and in my desk lighting, but when I took it into natural light on my porch to take pictures, and when I sat it on my easel for a few minutes while I was cleaning off my desk, I really started to see things that needed to be tweaked and adjusted, especially with value. And taking a picture of this on my phone and then editing it to where the saturation was dropped down to 0 would have also helped me see what needs to be adjusted. But finally, I got to a point where I was happy with the painting and excited about it. And here it is, all finished. And it just gives me all the spooky vibes. And I'm really excited to celebrate Halloween this weekend with my family. And I hope you have a fantastic weekend with yours. If you like this video, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more of what I create, please hit the notification bell and subscribe button. And if you have any questions, comments, or you just want to tell me about your epic Halloween costume, please leave it down below and I will do my best to answer it. Have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you next time.